All right, so welcome everybody. This is my 73rd birthday. I was a Sunday child. If you read my blog today, or maybe it was on Facebook, I mentioned it, but I was born on a Sunday, and the little nursery rhyme about, Monday's child, Tuesday's child, Sunday's child. Well, I won't say that I'm full of grace, but I do my best. And it just seemed really appropriate that when I was preparing this particular publication, that I launch it on my birthday. I did more or less the same thing with Magic. I launched it on basically the first weeks of July. It was a soft launch because we didn't have the internet much in those days. The Intentional Weaver I launched on my brother's birthday, partly because it was an homage to him, who was instrumental in getting Magic out into the world. A lot of people don't know this, but he essentially turned his rec room and basically his entire basement over to me for quite literally years. From 2002 until he died in 2008, I was still assembling copies of Magic, and then I had to get out of there so we could sell his house after he died. So 8 years I was putting Magic together. And so when I did the Intentional Weaver, I decided to dedicate it to him. And then this one I decided to launch on my birthday again, partly because I could tell that I was going to be finished in time, I thought. And I got to tell you, the last 2 weeks have been a mighty push and a shove to get it onto Blurb and ready to go. And it is now live. It went live yesterday. So you can purchase it there if you're interested. I don't have a book yet. This has all been very rushed, and because it took longer to get it uploaded in the format we wanted it to be in on Blurb, I still don't have my sample copy. So I thought what I'd do is I would print out the cover, and I don't know if this is mirror image or if you could actually read it, but this is what the cover looks like. The photograph got distorted a bit in the uploading to Blurb, and in the end, I decided I liked it. It had a sense of time-space dilation, if you will, and you got to be warped to weave, right? So a little warped photograph is just kind of appropriate for the cover of this book, because it is not a traditional weaving book at all. It is basically what one person wanted me to do when I did the Intentional Weaver. She wanted me to tell my stories. She wanted to hear my voice. When I was doing the Intentional Weaver, though, it was intended to be a textbook more than anything else. It was intended to be educational. It was intended to describe the processes and the equipment and the craft in a very educational way, at least my version of educational. But her comment kind of rattled around in the back of my brain. Add to that the fact that there was one person who called me a storyteller when she was driving me to the airport in Portland, Oregon. And nobody had ever said that to me before, and it resonated really, really deeply at a very deep soul level. And after she called me a storyteller, I decided to embrace that role. And also a lot of, before we had the printed word, how did we convey information? We told each other stories. And then I retired for certain values I've had a lot of health issues the last few years, and I realized that I simply couldn't keep doing what I'd been doing. And then COVID hit, and all of that. And my friend said to me, well, Laura, what are you going to do? Because we know you're not retired. You're going to be doing something. And it's like, I don't know. I'll figure it out. But one of the things I did want to do was go back to a more exploratory way of looking at how threads interlace and interact. But I didn't have the time. I was so busy trying to get rid of the studio, downsizing, reorganizing. I had to move everything out of my offsite location into my studio, which meant I had to totally snow globe the studio. And Doug spent weeks building shelving on against every available wall space so that we could empty boxes, because I've learned over the years that if it's in a box, it's forgotten. So I needed to be able to see what I had, and I needed to be able to start weaving down my stash, because as a production weaver who taught, I also had a stash for teaching and a stash for my own personal exploration, as well as my production stash. And so I got to tell you, I had a shit ton of yarn. And I needed to be able to see it, and I needed to be able to use it up. So I spent a lot of energy those first years of my retirement just weaving down my stash, anything that I could throw on the loom and quickly get woven and off the shelves in yarn form onto the shelves in woven form, because textiles store more compactly than tubes or cones of yarn. I mean, that's just a fact. And then, like I say, with COVID, we had the isolation, we had all sorts of other things going on. The entire world went into stress mode. And there just didn't seem to be time to think about anything else. And in the meantime, my health continued to deteriorate, and I was fighting with my body. But you know what they say, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Well, as a teacher, I know darn well that the teacher's been there all along. It's the student being ready to hear the message before they can see what they need to see. So I had one of those moments about 10 months ago. I was scrolling through Twitter and somebody posted a request for book reviewers for their book, which was being republished as a paperback. And it was Textile Design Theory in the Making by Elaine Igo. And I thought, gee, I could use more information about design theory. So, well, I mean, she can say no. And I messaged her and made a comment on her post on Twitter saying, I've sent you a DM. And then I sent her a direct message and said, this is who I am, production weaver, adjunct teacher at Olds College, as I was at the time. I have a blog with lots of followers, and if the publisher would be willing to provide me with a review copy, I would be happy to take a look at it. And when it arrived, it was not what I expected at all. It was something entirely different. And as I read the prologue, the introduction, and the first few pages, it was like, you know, my brain just exploded. Just, oh my goodness, I needed to know this. I would have liked to have known it 20 years ago, but man, am I glad it's arrived here now. So she was looking at how we think about design, specifically as it relates to textiles. And I could barely read it, because I'd read 3 paragraphs and I'd be going, oh, I got to sit and think about this, you know. And I kept working away at it, and I have these little sticky tabs, and I think every page has got at least half a dozen on them, so that when I want to go back, I can focus on those sentences or those paragraphs, and I can think about them more deeply. Because I had promised to write a review, and the book was being republished in paperback form in February, so I figured I'd better get this review done prior to that happening. but it really got me thinking in a way that I'd never quite thought before. And it was like, wow. And this just simmered in the back of my brain. And then a friend recommended a book to me, and I talk about this in Stories from the Matrix, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background for this talk. Tyson Yunkaporta wrote a book called Sand Talk. Now, he is from Australia with an Aboriginal background, and what he tries to do is bridge the communication gap between settlers and Aboriginals, because they don't communicate in the same way. And so things that one person means on the one side, the other side doesn't understand what they're talking about, because they don't process information in the same way. So he's trying to bring the two cultures together so that there can be meaningful conversation. And this again hit me very deeply. And along about that time, or I guess just before I got the Yunkaporta book, I was waking up in the morning, you know, that liminal space between not being really asleep but not yet awake. And I had an idea based on something that I had explored 20 years ago. And it suddenly occurred to me that I could apply that same sort of approach that I had used with summer and winter and with twills to twill blocks. And so with my 16 shaft loom, instead of getting 4 discrete blocks of twill, I could get 8, because instead of being discrete, I was going to overlap them. And I described this in Matrix as well, so there's a lot more information on that. And then Yunkaporta came along, and that again opened my thinking up in new directions and in new ways. So then all of a sudden, the imperative came to start writing. And it wasn't so much an educational approach, but more of the philosophical approach. Now, I had read a book of essays last summer as well, and I realized that I didn't have to write a book with start at point A and end at Z, or Z as we say. I could write a book of essays, and there did not have to be a logical thread that ran through them. They could just be discrete essays. So that's what I did. I started writing essays. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter, and they cover a very broad spectrum of what my life has been like as a weaver, both the production and the teaching, as a designer, marketing my own things, learning how to run my own business, traveling all over the place, meeting people. And it's a very eclectic collection of essays. So if you're looking for a how to learn book, I would refer you to The Intentional Weaver. If you're looking at understanding more about the philosophy or the theory or the way I think about weaving, then you might find some essays of interest to you in this collection. Are there any questions before I go on? No? Okay. So I've pulled a couple of essays here, just so that you're not going to be buying blind, shall we say. And as part of my ramblings, I had written out a theory of how we came to be weavers. And a couple of my 2 alpha readers both made the same comment. This sounds like a creation myth. And I looked at it again and I thought, yeah, they're right. Okay. Well, why don't I just make it a creation myth? So I rewrote it with that objective in mind. And I've used it as the prologue for the book, and it's called In the Beginning, A Creation Myth. We don't know when our ancient ancestors began to develop into the creatures that we have turned into. They had no written record that we know of, and there are a few artifacts that we can study. We can suppose, but all of those suppositions are based on what we know today, and those are heavily biased by where we are, what we do here and now. So I think about how people came to the point of creating string, that most useful of items, that simplest of tools. I think about where fibers come from, where our ancient ancestors might have discovered them by chance, as it were. My theory when I look at such yarn made from the fiber of the inner bark of a tree, spun so finely and then made into a 3-ply yarn or string, is that the Neanderthal people who made that cordage did not discover how to do it the day before that string was made. They had to have been working with fiber and spinning it for many years, perhaps generations, until they reached that skill level. I also wonder if the people who made such yarn survived longer, and that perhaps there is a working with fiber gene. Our ancestors who had little of what we today would call technology had to have the skills to create whatever technology it was that they needed. Did one of them see the plants after winter with their stems broken and the bast fibers beginning to break free, pluck some of the fibers away from the stem, then twiddle them into something useful like a length of string to tie the fish to? Which meant that they could carry more fish in one trip, therefore feed their family better. Did they then begin to make netting to make carry bags to put gathered food into to bring back to their camp? Once they could do that, did they then begin to make cloth from, say, wild fiber animals that shed their coats in the spring and then were able to survive cold weather better? Did they then capture some of those animals, domesticate them to have a ready supply of fiber to use? The development of any technology is dependent upon an individual or group of individuals thinking about their surroundings, their environment, beginning to explore, try things, figure out what worked and what didn't, then making tools to help make the work go more efficiently. But someone somewhere had to make the observation and share it with others. Once they had the knowledge, technology to make string, they could use it to tie things together. Moving camps suddenly became easier as they could secure bundles of smaller items, making it easier to move to a new location where there might be more food. From string, perhaps they started to make nets, and then fishing would have been easier. I wonder if they took inspiration from spider webs. We know that some people have used large spider webs to catch fish in recent history and may still do, I don't know. The shape of them, the making of a larger textile to do a specific job may well have opened the door to playing with netting techniques and then basketry. Buckets to carry home berries, water, larger plants like bulrushes to make mats to sit on instead of the ground, to make sleeping more comfortable. Those same mats could be strung up and used for shade from the sun or protection against rain. And once they had perfected making mats, a short step to grabbing one of those and pulling it around one's shoulders for personal protection against rain or snow. Because our ancient ancestors traveled, they might have moved in order to seek new sources of food. Perhaps their community had grown to the point that the local area could not support them, and some of them decided to move over to the next valley and try their luck there. Some of them might have just been curious about what was on the other side of the river or that mountain range they could see on a clear day. As they migrated, they would have encountered new climates, new foliage, new animals. They might not have had the plants and animals they were used to using for food and to make string, so they had to keep an open mind and look for other things they might use. Eventually, some people might have found a place where they could settle because they discovered that there were plants which gave edible seeds. No doubt they watched to see what the animals ate. Birds eating seeds meant that there was a good chance they could eat those seeds as well. Someone at some point realized that they could collect the seeds, keep them until spring, plant them, and then have a more reliable source of food. They had to figure out how to store them over winter By this time, I imagine they were already making pottery for water carrying and storage, so it was an easy solution to storing things like seeds, honey, nuts. If they were in a colder climate, they needed to keep warm, so they likely used animal skins to begin with. Perhaps they realized that they could capture wild sheep and keep them for food and skins, and then collect the shed fibers again and again, twiddle them into string. But wool is a much shorter staple than bast fibers, so they had to figure out a way to make string from short fibers. And someone had a handy stick that they wrapped the spun fibers onto, and then they had a spinning tool. From there, someone decided to add a rock or ball of clay and turn the stick into a spindle, and the task of spinning short fibers into yarn became more efficient. If they had been making baskets from reeds and branches, it would be an easy step to see that they could take finer string and use the same technique, plain weave, and make a thinner, lighter weight cloth that was flexible and would make much warmer blankets, then cloaks, then actual garments. They could have protection from the sun and hot climates, sunburn, and from the cold. To make weaving easier, there had to be a way to control all those individual strings. Perhaps they had figured out how to make straps and bands by staking out a warp, so all they had to do was scale up and peg out a wider, longer warp on the ground and then weave it. If they were living in villages, they could easily do that because they didn't need to up sticks, literally, and move every few days. For those who did need to move regularly, perhaps they realized that if they wound the unwoven warp onto a stick, they could just roll it all up and bring it with them to be staked out at their next camp. Homo sapiens tend to think that they were the ones who did all of this because the other species in our ancient past weren't as smart. But recent discoveries say differently. Neanderthal people also used string. Archaeologists largely ignored the tiny remnants of string cordage until recently, and it was generally thought that only Homo sapiens made it. It was thought that all the other human variants died out because Homo sapiens were superior to the other branches, but it has been proven that several coexisted. On a personal note, I did the National Geographic Genome Project, and my DNA includes not just Neanderthal, but also Denisovian DNA, an indication that a branch of my ancient ancestors migrated out of Africa, went east for a while, then turned back to the west until they wound up in what we now call Europe, eventually moving to North America. Making cloth from fibers is extremely labor intensive. Our ancestors had to figure out how to make cloth more efficiently because they soon realized that cloth, in whatever form it was, made living easier and increased their odds of survival. As our ancestors migrated and filled up the globe with their descendants, they had to adapt to the local conditions, climate, geography, local resources. By and large, they did an incredible job because here we are now, some 7 billion of us. Weaving has moved out of the hands of the individual, except for a very few, and into industry. But we forget that the textile industry is very young in comparison to how long it was made by hand, string by string, until very recently. Our ancient ancestors may not have been able to explain the science of textiles, the biology of the animals and plants that gave us fibers, the chemistry of dyeing, the physics of how the loom works, but they understood them, worked with them, adjusted them to the current conditions. They may not have had the words, but they had the knowledge. They may not have been able to document any of it in written form, but they did an excellent job of holding the knowledge and passing it on orally. We forget that before writing existed, all of the common knowledge was held in our memories and passed from one generation to the next by showing the new generation how to do it, telling them stories to make the lessons stick, because who doesn't love a good story? And how to do it over and over again until it was safely stored in their memory to pass on to the next generation and the next. And we forget that they did all of that without having the tools and knowledge. They had to invent it all. Now in the 21st century, we have a backlog of written knowledge to draw upon and tools, equipment, and experience of those who have gone before. But we must never forget that we stand upon the shoulders of giants who figured it all out on their own with nothing but their own brains and whatever resources were to hand at the time they were doing it. Questions? Comments? Observations? No? Okay, this next one is one of the longer ones. One of the benefits of doing what I've done for my life is that I wound up traveling a whole lot, way more than I ever expected that I might. So I've just summed up some of the trips that I made centered around textiles. It's certainly not a comprehensive listing of every place that I've been, but they are generally fond memories, and I just wanted to share them with you. So, I mean, if I was going to tell stories, then I wanted to tell some of my travel stories. Now, when you get the book, it doesn't have an index, but it does have a table of contents, and the essays are listed alphabetically. So it's kind of like sticking your hand into a bag of trail mix. You're not going to be quite too sure what's going to come out until you read it. Okay, that's just a little warning there. So this one is called Trips and Textiles. Rummaging around in my little gray cells has caused all sorts of memories to come to the fore. Many of them are associated with trips I've taken and the sometimes unexpected side trips that happened because I was in the right place at the right time with the right people. As a kid, we mostly did driving trips around the province. Growing up in a remote small town meant that if we needed anything special like medical treatments, our nearest big city was about 500 miles away. I spent many an hour on good old Greyhound bus toing and froing to Vancouver and home again. We stayed right downtown to be close to the ophthalmologist and therefore close to things like the museum, art gallery, and public transit, which was available to take us further afield. It wasn't until I was 16 that I set off on my own to go to Montreal for a family wedding. Not that there was much involved for me. Mom put me on the train at midnight, and 4 days later, her sister picked me up from the station. One of my cousins took me around to see the sights, but mostly it was a family trip. It wasn't until I returned 3 years later, also by train, that I saw a bit more of the city, including Mont Royal and St. Joseph's Oratory, where a family member had worked, served, and was still remembered. Growing up in BC in a small town, I had thought that Vancouver seemed very old until I experienced Montreal. But then I experienced Europe. My trip to Montreal in 1969 was the first stage in my heading across the pond via a small freighter that took a very small number of passengers. The ship sailed down the St. Lawrence and then headed north. We stopped off the coast of Newfoundland to jig for cod. I caught 3. What can I say? Cod aren't very bright. We spent 11 days on the voyage, saw some gray whales heading northward for the summer, experienced some fairly rough seas, but eventually sailed into the fjord and disembarked close to Oslo. I had no idea how to get to the train station, so asked the captain for advice. He offered to take me to Central Station when he headed into the city to report to his head office. He was kindness himself, not only not accepting any money for the cab fare, also arranging for me to cash some of my traveler's checks, no credit cards in those days. Then talked to the clerk to make sure I got a ticket to the correct place and checked my baggage. It was pretty much an all-day journey with a train change at one point. I wasn't used to a 24-hour clock and thought I'd missed my connection. No one admitted to speaking English, so it was a frightening few minutes until I managed to figure out my connection left in about an hour. Phew. When I arrived at Örebro at 9 p.m., I had no Swedish currency, only Norwegian, and no luggage. I had not understood that checking one's bags meant that they arrived the next day on a freight train, not on the same train as it was done in Canada. The story is very long, but not particularly pertaining to textiles, so I'll skip on to talk about a day trip to Stockholm. As part of my first time in Sweden, I went by train to Stockholm and had a day there to wander around. I didn't want to go too far from Central Station, and it was very close to the old city or Gamlastan. I spent the afternoon wandering up and down the small cobblestone lanes, some of them so narrow I could stretch my arms out and touch the walls on either side. I also found the castle where there was some digging happening in the basement, and there was a small display of some of the finds from the midden they had uncovered. No textiles as such, but the remnants of a tiny leather shoe and some wood and pottery. I looked in shop windows, appreciating the very different design aesthetic, the clean lines, the textiles with large block prints. Marimekko was just becoming known in North America, and I got a glimpse of some of her clothing and other textile prints just by looking in the shop windows. Back in Örebro, I finished the sweater I'd been knitting and wanted some other handwork to do. I couldn't read knitting patterns, but I had spotted a shop that sold embroidery supplies. So one day I got on the bus and headed into town. By this time, I had learned a few crucial phrases like, "How much does this cost?" And when they told me the answer, I would respond, "Skriv, skriv," and make writing motions with my hand. When I went into the shop, I was the only customer in the place, so I asked if the woman could speak English. Oh, she could not. But I saw some lovely things, and I really needed some handwork. So I motioned at the racks of pattern books on the counter and asked if I could look. Yeah. I flipped through the papers until I found something that caught my eye and then tapped on that page and smiled. She dug through her files and brought out the pattern. I looked at the cloth, unsure what to buy, so she pointed out the appropriate linen for that design, agreed I should have enough cloth for two small doilies, then held up skeins of embroidery yarn. It was pearl cotton, not floss, because the design was hardanger. Then asked if I needed needles. Oops, yes, of course. Tack! She added it all up and I handed her the cash. She gave me my change, and then she wrapped up my purchase like it was a gift, which was standard practice in those days before plastic bags had taken over the world. When I showed my friend, she was astonished. Had I ever done that kind of embroidery before? No. Well, it's very difficult, she assured me. It didn't look all that difficult to me, just time-consuming, which was kind of what I was wanting. In the end, I didn't do the interior cut work because I was worried I would cut the stitching, and it looked pretty good to me without being cut. All I cut was around the sculptured edge because I could use my small embroidery scissors and be very careful to cut only the cloth, not the stitching. With a trip of nearly 3.5 months, I decided that I wanted to see more of Europe. I had just enough money left that I could buy a ticket for a bus tour of the continent. Again, I had to take the train to Stockholm, change to the train to Malmö, and then get myself to the ferry terminal. I almost missed the ferry because I had found the wrong terminal and was the very last person up the proper gangplank. I think they pulled it up behind my heels. The bus tour started in Travemünde, Germany, and we went first to Belgium and saw a few sites there before heading west to Paris. It was a bit of a whirlwind trip, and we mostly stayed on the bus, driving around the Arc de Triomphe, stopping at the Eiffel Tower for tea, passed by the Louvre, a quick stop at Notre Dame, had dinner at a very old, very famous restaurant, name escapes me in the mists of time, before heading south for the Riviera. Our destination was Nice, where we stayed for 5 days. One day trip took us to Cannes, where we enjoyed the sandy beach, another to Grasse to visit the perfumery there, established by the nuns as their means of income. It had been in operation since something like the 1400s. And one day to Monaco, where I lost a coin in a one-armed bandit in the lobby of the hotel, just so I could brag I'd gambled in Monte Carlo. We also had time to ourselves to explore the city of Nice, walk down the Promenade des Anglais, and get chased by a young man desperate to get 4 young women to go on a party boat. I declined. The other 3 agreed that maybe sailing out into the Mediterranean with a boatload of strangers might not be the best idea, so we all stayed on shore. From there, we headed back north, stopping overnight in Milan, then through Switzerland, through the very long train tunnel where the vehicles drove onto the train's flat deck cars in order to avoid the grueling drive over the mountain pass, staying one night in Germany, then finally back to Travemünde and the ferry back to Malmö. From there, I returned to Stockholm and Örebro. I had purchased my ticket to fly home, my very first time on an airplane. before I left on the tour to make sure I didn't spend more on the tour than I could afford. But by the time I got back to Örebro, I was almost out of money. So I borrowed 100 kroner from my friend's mother, promising that my mother would send a bank money order as soon as I got home. Pretty sure she figured she would never see her money again, but once I got home, I made sure to get the international bank order and mailed it back, airmail. And that, I thought, was my big one-time adventure, assuming I would never make it across the pond again. However, in 1974, Doug and I decided to go to Sweden because he really wanted to experience the country too. But the world was in an oil crisis, so we decided to go in January before the tour season. Why January? Why not? We both lived in winter country. Going to Sweden wouldn't be all that different. Again, long story, but we made it after weather and equipment-related delays and stayed with my friend and her husband and daughter. They advised us to buy a month-long residence transit pass because it would make going into Stockholm from the bedroom community they lived in a lot cheaper. We found the pass extremely useful as it could be used on the commuter train to go into Stockholm, but also any subway or bus we needed to go sightseeing. On the Saturday, our friends took us to Nordiska Museet, the National Museum of Sweden, where I saw some extraordinary textiles, including the coronation clothing worn by Gustav I for his coronation in 1523. We brought our down parkas, and the wind blowing in from the north made us very grateful we had. As part of that trip, we took the train to the far north to visit a couple I had met on the tour in 1969, and they showed us around their area, which didn't look very different from where we lived in BC. Later that year, I got to go on a tour of England with school students and teachers, and once again, when I got home, I figured that was it for my travel adventures. And then I learned to weave. I've written about the trip to Finland elsewhere, but as part of that trip, we went to Nordiska Museet in Stockholm. There were displays of textiles. Sorry. One room was devoted to the traditional dress of the different provinces, and they were all stunning. We were there for midsummer, so we went to the big park, Skansen, for the midsummer festivities before boarding the ferry to Finland. Again, lots of traditional dress to be seen. Now I really thought I'd traveled abroad as much as I ever would. Instead, I started traveling to teach in my region, attending conferences in the US, Convergence 78 being my very first weaving conference, and then beginning to teach as well. In 1990, I met a Swedish weaver at conference, re-met online, and then she and her partner came here before the Anway conference in Bozeman, Montana. As part of getting to know her, I found out she had acquired a large cold mangle. As I began preparations for publishing Magic in the Water, I asked if I could mail her some cloth and have her mangle and return it. She informed me a proper researcher would come and do it herself. And so I began planning another trip to Sweden, this time bringing a laptop and a large piece of linen cloth. Much of Magic was written in Sweden in the middle of the night while I adjusted to the 9-hour time zone change, as well as times when she was busy. We visited a school in Uppsala and saw the student work, went to Hemslöjden to see what the students were doing there, to Nordiska Museet, and spent time on Gamla Stan. We saw other places as well, including a weaving studio where I saw warping ballet for the first time and warp flanges, visited a spinning mill, and in Stockholm saw a silk mill and a manor house with a special exhibit of textiles inspired by a Florentine artist from the Middle Ages. When it was time to go home, a friend in England had insisted that I stop and visit her there, and as a result, I wound up getting to see a loom manufacturing place, not hand looms, but gigantic rug-making looms. They had also begun making looms for the Harris tweed weavers, as Harris was experiencing a resurgence of interest in genuine Harris tweed. Alan Fannin had suggested I check them out. My friends drove me from the west coast of England all the way to the east coast because the factory was just outside of Newcastle. As we were trying to find the factory, I kept seeing signs to Hadrian's Wall. I casually asked if we were close, and they both said, yes, let's go home that way. We stopped to see Vindolanda, the old Roman fort that has been carefully developed as an educational site. There were a few textiles, but I think they were reconstructions. Still, it was interesting to see an example of cloth likely being used at the time the fort was occupied by Roman soldiers. One day we went to the lake country and visited Gawthorpe Hall. There were 3 of us, one a knitter, one a bobbin lace maker, and me. The knitter was also interested in spraying, so she requested examples of spraying. The lace maker asked for lace examples, and I asked for textiles. What did I want to see? What do you have? From the 1400s onwards. I'll begin with the 1400s then. They brought me examples of cloth that would have been at home in portraits of the time, and I got a very close look. Yes, they actually let me touch the cloth, and appreciated that one reason all those portraits looked so stiff may have been because their clothing was so stiff. Of course, the examples were all from the upper class, not the lower classes. I'm sure the lower class clothing got worn out, not carefully preserved like the upper class clothing, or perhaps even cut up into samples to sell to tourists during the Grand Tour in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That was in 2000, and again, I assumed that I would never cross the pond again. However, 2002 arrived, and a friend was getting married in Sweden, so I made arrangements to visit with my weaving friend, and we had some adventures, visiting some places like the Eklunds Mill, a dye house where I learned a lot about dyeing linen, and another small mill that was processing, spinning, and weaving linen. I would go again in 2004 when we went on our Vodmall adventures, and then again in 2013. My friend had been talking about going to England, and we decided I would meet her in Sweden. Then we would drive to Denmark to catch the ferry to England. I had been approached to present a lecture on wet finishing in Scotland, so we headed north, did the lecture, and then started making our way south, stopping at every textile mill museum we could find, and even meeting some people we knew from online chat groups. We had talked about the Swedish conference and then began making plans for me to go over in 2017, this time with Doug, who was now retired and wanting to travel. When my lace-making friend found out, she insisted we come to her as well. Our plans were made, and we stopped in England first, then headed over to Sweden, flying to Copenhagen, then taking the train to Sweden. We attended the conference, and I got to see the Flying J Loom, meeting a couple more people that I only knew online. There were vendors. Yes, I bought fine linen yarns and exhibits to see. And now my traveling days are done. As I write these essays, the memories come back and I count my blessings. The experiences I've had, the people and places I never thought I could ever see, all because I did it, even if I was scared out of my mind on many occasions. The world is so much bigger than we can imagine, so much more beautiful. People can be incredibly kind and generous. All of these trips would have been much less interesting, less memorable, if not for the local people who were kind and accepting. I have traveled more miles, either driving myself or being driven or flown, than I ever had any right to expect. And yet I've seen just a tiny fraction of this world. Ultimately, I would have loved to have gone more places, seen much more of this world, but I can armchair travel now. There are TV programs, the internet, and books. I will continue to explore what I can, given the tools that I have available. Okay, Vicki, have we had any questions?
Nope, just a lot of comments on, wow, what incredible stories. So glad that you wrote them down for like the benefit. Everyone's just, I could listen to you all day.
I hate to tell you this, but I could talk all day.
Oh, we have, Jane has a question. You can unmute, Jane, if you just want to talk.
Yeah, Laura, I did not come planning to ask this question, but the question that comes up is, so what's next?
Don't know. I have no idea. What's next is going to be my rededication to continuing to weave down my stash. I got to take this off. It's bugging me. I just posted on Facebook that I just ordered another 18 pounds of yarn so that I could use up my stash. I've been making tea towels mostly, and I have some here to show you, using 216 cotton as warp and 220 mercerized cotton as weft. And I think I must have had at least 40 pounds of 220 mercerized cotton. It might have been a bit more. It was several boxes and bins worth. And right now I figure I've got maybe 12 pounds left. And, you know, my Protestant Scrooge or scrimper, or so whatever you want to call it, is just refusing to let me get rid of the yarn. No, you pay good money for that yarn, you will damn well use it up, or more of it than you have. So I just placed an order for 18 more pounds of 216 cotton. This time in, excuse me, I've been using white as the work primarily on this series. I did use teal for a while because I had it on hand. Switched to white because it's cheap and it's plentiful. But now I have odds and ends of things that need to get used up. And a lot of them are really dark value colors, which look okay, excuse me, which look okay on the natural white, but it's such a high contrast. I decided that a really dark blue would be useful for once I've finished with the 220 mercerized cotton. I could use some of my leftover 216 cotton on it, and I could weave with the rest of the natural white onto the dark blue to get a kind of a Delft appearance of that, you know, the dark Bristol blue and white of the Delft pottery. I thought it would look quite nice. So that's my story, sticking to it. I was glad I ordered when I did, because when I placed the order, I saw that Brossard will be closed from July 14th well into August. Not that I'm in any danger of running out of yarn before then, believe me, but somehow, you know, I got to have my comfort stash so I don't get too antsy about running out of yarn. So okay.
That's a question.
Yeah, asking if I visited Glass Bowls. I think I did. It sounds very familiar. I don't remember the name of the linen mill we stopped at, and then but that might have been it. It's a very familiar name to me, and I don't quite know why. We went to Eklund's once, and there is an essay about the trip to Eklund's in the collection. We also visited the studio of Polka. Can't remember his last name. In the Crystal Kingdom. I can't remember the province name. Near Vecchio. And that was where I saw the warping valley and warp flanges for the first time, was in Folka's studio. And I think I also included that, passing reference to that. Yeah, I've spent way more time in Sweden than I ever expected. Even given that I had a Swedish pen friend from the age of 12 up until I finally lost contact with her in, I don't know, 2002, I guess. They may have moved and I just didn't get an address change or something, I don't know. So I've seen quite a lot of Sweden, mostly Stockholm, of course, because that's usually where you arrive and, you know, you spend some time there. No, I'm not Scandinavian as such, although ancestry.com says that I do have some Scandinavian DNA in me way back when, who knows where. My background is actually French Canadian, and my father identified as German, although they emigrated from Europe, from Belarus. However, Belarus was part of the Hanseatic League, and there were a lot of German culturally German people that lived all along that shoreline. On the other hand, I don't know. They lost touch with their family back in Europe after the Second World War. So I really don't know. And of course, my father was born here, so he really didn't know much anyway. So, but I have a lot of appreciation for Scandinavian design. Like I say, the the textiles that I saw when I was over there appealed to me very much. And in my early weaving days, I leaned pretty heavily on that design aesthetic, so much so that when I first started selling my textiles, I was weaving in the late 1970s, early 1980s, things that did not look hand woven because I was using 2/8 cotton and plain weave and twills, not thick wool with lots of texture. So my first craft fair ever, I had not one but two different women approach me in my booth and asked me where I bought the fabric to make my tea towels. And I said, well, I made it. And they gave me this really peculiar look and they said, no, where did you buy the fabric? And I said, I made the fabric. And one of them got quite perturbed with me, or as my mother would say, protrude. What can I say? She was French Canadian. It came out in odd ways at times. And she insisted, I know you made it, but where did you buy the fabric? And I said, I'm a weaver. I took the thread and made it into cloth. I made the cloth. And she sort of went, stalked off. And I knew exactly what she was getting at. She was going to go down to the fabric store or wherever I bought the yardage, cut it to length and hand hem it herself because she had the skills, but she wasn't going to get it unless she paid my price. Okay. Sorry, Judith, I went off on a tangent like I usually do. Did I answer your question?
Yes. I was wondering, I want to go back to your first essay when you were talking about how textiles have evolved from being thread by thread through the ages and are now industrialized, basically. I wonder what your thoughts are on what makes us as weavers and spinners and knitters and any kind of discipline, what makes us dig deep into our brains and our souls to embrace textiles again, thread by thread. I mean, why? This topic fascinates me, and I just wondered what your thoughts on it are.
I passed it and mentioned it in passing. I think that some of us have a working with textiles gene. I honestly do. Yeah.
I don't know, just out of the blue, when I was 29 years old, brand new baby, born and raised in the city, never knew anything about it. All of a sudden, I just wanted to make yarn for some reason. I don't know where that came from. And I do think it's genetic. That's sort of what my belief is. And I'm so glad I have it and others have it as well, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, my Genesis story is very long and convoluted because the universe worked very, very hard to put me in front of a loom. Honestly, it really worked very hard to get me in front of a loom, and I've written about it on my blog fairly extensively and other places. But what I will share with you is here's the Coles Notes version. My father was dying, and it was very apparent to me that life could be short, sharp, and sometimes not very sweet. So if I really, really wanted to do something, I needed to do it now, because my father lived his life waiting for a ship to come in and it sank in the damn harbor. You know what I'm saying here? He waited and waited and waited for his turn, and he died at the age of 56. So I was in my 20s by this point, and I was not happy with any of the jobs that I had done to that point. And I realized that what I desperately needed for my soul to thrive was to have some component of creativity in my life on a regular basis. And if I could do that making things, then I could be independent from somebody else's deadlines, whims, directions, demands, whatever, not realizing that my boss was going to be the much worse than any employer I ever worked for. I got stories about that too. But anyway, in March of the year 1975, I was taking the textile class at the college. I started out taking the spinning class, and then we went into the small looms for the second semester. In the meantime, I was getting a weekly tutorial on what was going on in the loom room from a fellow classmate. And in March of that year, we were driving somewhere. Might have been home from the hospital after visiting my dad one more time after another health crisis. And I said to my husband, you know, I think a person could weave fabric and sell it and make some money. And there was this thoughtful silence. And he said, is that what you want to do? And I said, yeah, I think so. So he said, well, guess you better buy a loom. And I said, our house is too small for a loom. And it wasn't too small. It was just that the house was inappropriate to set up a weaving studio, which is what I knew I needed to do. So he said, well, then I guess we better sell it and buy a bigger one. So we put our house up for sale. Eventually it sold before we found another house, and we had to go further into debt than we wanted to because we needed to be out of that house like quickly. And so we took on a bigger mortgage than we had wanted to, in part based on the fact that I was working at a custom drapery house and making a very good wage for a woman. And so we could qualify for a higher amount. And we never breathed a word of the fact that as soon as the mortgage was approved, I would be quitting my job and going to school full time. So anyway, so March I made the decision. The house sold. We bought a new one, this one that we're in, and we were moving in the last week of August. And my father went into hospital again over the Labor Day weekend for the final time. As soon as the mortgage was approved, the first week of September, I handed in my resignation, and I had to give them 2 weeks notice because they had nobody to take over from me. I had to give them that obligatory 2 weeks notice. I phoned the instructor at the college and said, Elaine, I'm registered for the weaving class. I can't make it the first day of class. What do I need to do for the second day of class? And she was like, wait, what? You're not coming to class? And I said, I can't. I got to work. You know, that I got no choice in the matter. I have to give 2 weeks notice, and I have to miss the first day of class. So she was sort of like, oh, no, bring some rag strips and we'll put you on the rag rug loom. And I went, okay, fine. What do you mean rag strips? Tell me more. So she said, oh, if you've got an old sheet or something, just tear it up into about 1 inch or 3/4 inch width strips and bring that. So I did that, and I walked into class the second week with my little paper bag full of my strips, which I had attached end to end so that they were a continuous thing, plus the hems, which had been in a contrasting color. And I figured, well, I can use the straight part for the body of the rug, and then I can use the solid blue for a border on either end. Shoot, I meant to bring that and show it to you. Oh, well, it's on my blog. So I walked in and I said to Elaine, okay, I'm here. And she said, I'm busy. Go talk to Susan, the teaching assistant. So I walked into the weaving room and I said, Susan, I'm here. What do I need to do? And she said, I'm busy. Just go wait. So I walked in and I went, so the other students were there, and I said, well, you know, I was saying hello to people that because I knew them from the class previous, and they said, oh, you're here. I said, yeah, Elaine and Susan told me just to start on the rug loom, and they said, oh, it's that one beside you. And it was a big old Scandinavian style overhead feeder counterbalance. I'm looking at it and going, okay, now what do I do? So I said to them, okay, so what do I do? And they said, well, just use the treadles at the bottom and then put your weft in. Because I knew about weft. I knew you made a shed because we'd done that on the small looms, right? So I thought, okay, I guess I'll do about this much of the main color and then switch to the solid. And nobody told me I should weave a header. The warp was cotton seine twine, and it had no header holding those rags in place, which was fine as long as the warp was under tension in the loom. So I wove so much, I reserved about as much as I figured I needed to be equal on the other end, wove the blue, wove up all the rest of the solid color, wove the blue, wove the rest of the solid color. I said, okay, I'm done now, what do we do? And they said, oh, just cut it off. And again, nobody told me that there should be a header there holding those weft strips into these cotton seine twine warp. So I said, well, where do I cut it? And they said, oh, just advance the warp some more and then just cut it as long as you want your fridge to be. So, okay, fine. So I released the tension off the back of the loom because it was a dog and pawl brake system and there was no brake release on it. And rolled it forward. Didn't roll it forward as much as I should have, but I rolled it forward and I started cutting. And as I started cutting, the cotton seine twine started dropping down because they were no longer in tension. And then they looked like they were trying to slither out of the reed. So I quickly finished cutting off the rest as out of the peripheral vision. I could see the warp threads were kind of, backing out of the reed. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't let this happen. So I took, and of course, the textile, the web, was no longer under tension. And the cotton seine twine was going, whoop, and all the rag wefts were falling out. So I took the bundle, still attached to the apron, put it down on the loom bench, and then I ran to the back of the loom to let off more warp. While I was doing that, one of the other students came by, and the bundle of stick and threads fell onto the floor. I thought, well, you can't go anywhere from there, so you could just sit there. And I was gently letting off more warp very carefully so that I didn't disturb the warp and pull any of it out of the heddles. Some had already come out of the reed. And this other student walked by me and saw my bundle of sticks and string sitting on the floor and swooped down on it. Now, she was French Canadian, and I'm going to mimic her accent because my mother was French Canadian, and it was just like my mother's voice yelling at me, "Oh, your rug is on the floor!" She started to pick it up. Now you gotta picture me, 25 years old, very shy. I know this is shocking, but I am shy. Taught to respect her elders. Like, you never yell at an elder, right? All I could see was the entire effort of stripping the rags out, getting them into a continuous strip, getting them into the warp, exploding back into its constituent parts because it was now no longer on tension. And I yelled at her, "Stop! Drop it!" And she was bent over with her hands just starting to pick up the bundle. And she was like, "What?" And I stood up and I walked over. I said, "Drop it." And I put my foot on it so that she couldn't pick it up. And I said to her, "It's a rug. It belongs there." And that was the seminal moment that I turned into a real weaver. Okay, looking at the historic fabric samples at the Fortress of Louisbourg and Cape Breton. Yes, and I do have an essay where I reference that visit. It was an amazing opportunity. And I wish that I could have gone back to take the archaeologist up on their offer to let me examine them more closely. She said I could apply for a research permit and come back and use their microscope and take a closer look at them. I'm not going to say too much about it, except that the story is in the collection of essays. I think the most impressive thing to me was the absolute quantity of textiles that they recovered from that midden. Now, they were all a rather dirty dirt color. They said that it's likely pigment picked up from the soil. They have no idea what the original colors were. They would have to do some kind of chemical analysis to see if they could discover if they had been dyed or something. But basically, the color was accumulated through age of it sitting in the midden. Their main focus is on the British occupation. So these textiles, given the rest of the artifacts in the midden, they place to about the British occupation period of time. They were just scraps, literally just scraps, little bits and pieces of things. There was enough of a knitted balaclava left to be able to identify that it was a balaclava, you know, pull down hood with a slot opening for the eyes. They don't know if there was a slot opening for the mouth because that was gone. But certainly the opening for the eyes was still there, and it was clearly knitted. We could tell that easily. Again, the overwhelming sense of the absolute skill involved in the making of textiles by hand, even if they might be in a factory setting or some such, was extremely high. The vast majority of the few samples that we were able to take a look at were singles. I can't remember if the knitting was a double or even a triple ply. I don't know. I can't tell you that. But the vast majority of the fabrics had been woven from singles, both warp and weft. There is a piece of a vest, which I've included in the book, where it's the bottom point of probably a vest or waistcoat, as the British call them. It has that look of at the time, the shape of the base of the vest, where they would have little points that come down off of the button band. It was 2 layers of cloth. The outer layer was spun and woven from a slightly thicker grist woven in twill, and the lining looked like a slightly thinner yarn woven in plain weave, so that the cloth, the overall garment, would not be quite so thick as my thought on it. And there are handmade buttonholes that are quite clearly defined there. They're not actually worn that much or not. You can clearly see that it is a buttonhole, and it is hand stitched with a buttonhole stitch. There were some examples of twill. Most of the textiles were twill or plain weave. Many of them were heavily fulled, but by being very careful, we could, and because they were so badly worn, a lot of the nap had worn off the surface of the cloth. You could see that it was plain weave usually underneath that. Mostly men's garments, they assume. On the other hand, they found quite a number of artifacts of felted hearts. They were little heart shapes. And the thinking is that the heart shape was laid in the crook of the thumb to reinforce that area of the mitten They found them child-sized. So they are pretty sure that although it was a fortress and that it was, you know, a home for soldiers, that there were also civilians and children living on the site. So it would be extremely interesting to go and be able to use their microscope and be able to examine the textiles in much greater detail than we could manage, you know, using our iPad as a enlarging tool or whatever. We were not able to touch them, but she said that if I applied for a research grant, or someone were to apply for a research grant, they could, under supervision, handle the textiles appropriately with gloves to protect them, and use their microscope to take a much closer look at them. And I really hope somebody locally does that, because they don't have any funding to do the investigation. All they've managed to do so far is itemize them and get them properly stored in you know, archival boxes. So there's not much more than that I can tell you. It was knit. In the 1700s, knitting was well established. There's no question about that. As for null binding, we didn't see enough of the collection to know. But, you know, knitting is so much faster than null binding. I'm pretty sure that by that point, knitting had probably pretty much surpassed null binding in terms of what was commercially available, particularly for something like troops. Okay. Yeah, I was meant to be a weaver. When I sat down at that loom for the very first time with the shuttle in my hand, a sense washed over me that I had come home. And I've spoken to other people who are as obsessed as I am, and obviously Judith. Yeah, it was definitely a homecoming feeling. And you know, it just feels like I must have some sort of, you know, if you believe in previous lives, I'm pretty sure I was a weaver in a previous life somewhere. But otherwise, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they start breaking down the genetic code and start finding that some people are more predisposed to some activities than others, especially life-saving ones like pottery or woodworking or weaving, that sort of thing. Yeah, April, if you go to the Government of Canada website and search for archaeological research permit, you will find some information there. And you could also contact the site and ask if you could speak to an archaeologist and find out what the chances are that it could happen. And if you do, please let me know. I would love to know what you find out if you take a deep dive. I would love to know more.
I think we're all caught up now, unless anyone else has any questions.
Okay, so if you're still interested, I'm sorry. Like I said to Michelle Boyd, the problem is not getting me started talking, it's getting me to shut up. I have a few things here to share with you. So this was the actual textile that was the conscious decision to become a weaver. Up until that point, I'd been listening politely to the weekly tutorial on weaving without too much thought of ever weaving myself. And like I say, I was working at a custom drapery shop. And one morning, Helen, who was Norwegian and knew that I'd been to Sweden, said to me, "Oh, Laura, we got some new samples in and they're from Sweden." So I was very interested to see what they were. And this is what it was. So I took a look at it and, okay, bumblebee, how did they make that? Because it's not a print. So when I looked closely at it, I realized It's 2 layers. It's double weave. And I looked at it and I thought, oh, I see what they've done. They've woven 2 layers of cloth one on top of each other. And in order to create the bumblebee, they pulled some threads up from the bottom and pushed the corresponding threads from the upper layer down. I'd done just enough weaving that I got the concept. And that was the spark that got me consciously thinking about becoming a weaver, not just mucking around playing with a spinning wheel. And I wasn't really enjoying the small looms. I mean, they're okay, and you can make some pretty things pretty quickly, but they weren't kind of capturing me. But when I saw this, there was a part of me that got triggered, the intellectual part, the analytical part, the questioning part. How did they do this? I know how they did it, but how exactly was that done? What did they need to do in order to create this effect? And as I fed that into the synapses, I started looking at the other textiles around me and started examining them more closely and more intellectually, more analytically, and started to get a sense of not just the breadth of what weaving entailed, but the depths to which it could be dug down into. So in the end, I realized that I would never know everything there was to know about weaving, but I could make a pretty good stab at digging down a couple of places. I started out by weaving anything and everything, just so that I had some kind of sense for what was possible. And I felt, at times I felt very untethered, because I didn't know where to start. I didn't know what to do. And it suddenly occurred to me that setting up some creative limitations was the appropriate way to approach weaving for me. It's not everybody's, but it is for me. Because if I set up creative limitations, that narrows my choices down, and then I'm better able to make some informed choices. Well, I wasn't very informed to begin with, but I rapidly informed myself. So I've brought just a few things here. I've talked about this briefly from time to time on my blog. The local Ukrainian dance troupe approached me at one point wanting to have fabric for a couple of their dance costumes. I call them costumes. They're not really costumes. They're traditional dress. But for the purposes of the dance troupe, they wanted the textiles for each of the dances to be consistent within themselves. I wanted to make sure that I was doing the correct version of the cloth, and I spent quite some time investigating traditional dress because I'd also been exposed to it in Sweden and in Finland. We had visited a museum there as part of my trip to Finland. And so I was interested in traditional dress anyway. Of course, we have a fairly large Dutch population here, and on Canada Day, they would frequently get dressed up in their traditional dress. And so I wanted to make sure that I was doing the right one. Come to find out that there is no one right one. Basically, each village has a particular look that is recognizable from a distance, but each individual textile can be different within that look as long as the long-range view is recognizable as being from their village. When you get up to the close details, they can have individual creativity within the look of the particular village or area that they are from. So the first one that I did, the women wore a skirt, which was basically just 2 panels of cloth, front and back, open at the sides, so that their underdress, their linen underdress, showed through. And the color was predominantly orange. But within that orange, you could have all sorts of other colors, as long as the long range look of the cloth was a pretty bright orange. It could be a lot of other colors thrown in. So for this particular one, it's primarily orange. There's a dark orange. It's primarily a medium orange. There's a forest green, a bright yellow, just a little bit of yellow, because a little bit of yellow goes a long way. And a rusty orange, and then a moss green. And I just beamed them randomly. I sectional worked. So I had all of the packages on my spool rack, and I just filled each section, and then I just took the colors randomly, however they came into my hand. I did not make any effort whatsoever to organize the colors into any kind of a pattern or design. So that was one. The other components that they wanted me to weave were the vests, which were made from wool. And the one example they had to show me was a basket weave, which I found interesting, woven from a fairly coarse singles. And at the time, and I believe they're still in business, brain fog. Gosh, I use that yarn for a lot of things. At any rate, it was a fairly coarse wool. I used it a lot for making blankets, and I checked with them. I said, are you okay with this quality for the vests? I didn't have anything in a basket weave, but I had blankets. He said, oh no, that's perfect. And I said, well, if that's okay, then I'll go ahead and place my order. When it came, it had a lot of vegetation in it, like really, really huge amounts of dried straw in it. And I spent hours trying to pick this straw out. When I delivered it, I was going to give them a discount because of all the straw in it. And they went, oh no, that's perfect. It's supposed to be rustic. These things would have had straw in it anyway. So this is perfect. And it was like, okay, I'll take the whole amount, because this was a lot of work. And then later they came back to me for another women's skirt, and again, 2 panels. This time they were side panels with the split at the front and the back, which would then show off the linen underskirt. And I gave them the option of what colors they could use in the squares. So in this one, what I did was this is the warp, the way the warp runs. The square has a black yarn in it, and then each square is divided with a white, let's see, 1, 2, 3 white threads. They were then woven. They were supposed to be square, but in the end, I couldn't get it to square up. And if I beat it any harder, it would have made the textile really, really stiff. So I let the squares be elongated somewhat, and I didn't worry too much. As long as they were consistent, I didn't worry too much about it. So this is the entire width from selvage to selvage. You will notice that I just ran the colors up the side. And then when they hemmed it, they could just cut the loops off or leave them as they chose. And I had several different colors there, and I told them that they could choose 3 colors maximum, because I had a 4-box fly shuttle. So I told them they could have 3 colors to choose from. And this one is a blue, a red, and a green. And then that just repeats blue, red, green all the way through it. So I have 2 pieces of that left. I then cut them into skirt lengths for them, so that all they had to do was just hem them to the length they needed them, and then hem the selvages back from that. A few years later, they came back and ordered more from me, and I did more at that time. And then finally, a few years later, they came back and said, the garments are so expensive that we've decided to buy club costumes. And then people can just, they don't have to buy their own, and they can just use the ones that we own as a group. And she was sort of like, "Are you okay with that?" And I went, "Yes, you're paying me for what I'm doing. I don't mind if you do that approach." So they got more of the orange skirts. They got more of these red, black, and white grid ones. They got more of the vest fabric. Then they asked for the cloth for the headdresses for this particular one, which was, oh my, that was a challenge. They wanted it to have metallic in it. And I said I could add some, but it would not be a large amount. And they said they just wanted something so that under the stage lights, there would be a glitter coming off of the headdresses. And then I said, if they want more glitter than that, then they can sew beads on. And they went, "Oh yeah, that's fine, we can do that." Seven shuttles in a very specific repeating sequence. And it was really challenging to weave. And then they wanted 40 yards or 40 meters, give or take, of sashes. And I've got a photograph in the book showing the sashes that I did. I was not going to weave 40 yards of sashes on an inkle loom. That was just not going to happen. So I thought, what can I do to make this so that I still wind up earning a little bit of money? And I thought, okay, I can dress the Leclerc fanny and use the treadles, and then I'll have the beater to beat the weft in. But the thing is, these sashes are supposed to be warp faced, right? So I could not get the beater to beat the weft in tightly enough that it was weft faced. So I thought, okay, take it out of the reed, remove the reed and the beater top from it, and use it like a small band loom with treadles and a 6 shuttle, which I was using anyway. And so I did, and that helped enormously. I was able to do the sashes in 4 warps and weave them quite quickly. And I got really, really good at getting my selvages decent and making sure that I was consistent. I use a Leclerc stick shuttle because one edge is beveled. And when you are winding a stick shuttle, wind a figure 8 across the spine of it, leave the other edge free, and then you've got a beater and a shuttle all at once. This is not unknown to small band weavers to do this. So I got them done and they were absolutely delighted. And yeah, there we go. All right. In my rummaging, I found a small piece of the linen cloth that is part of Magic in the Water. And this was the piece of cloth that was responsible for me to going to Sweden in 2000 to get it wet finished. And this was mangled on a very large cold mangle. It was purchased in the 1920s for a woman who was opening a boarding house where she provided housekeeping, including doing the cleaning of the sheets. And so as she was preparing this boarding house to open to take tenants, they opened the attic and had the mangle, which weighed 1,450 kilos, installed in her attic. We know it was installed in her attic because when my friend went to buy it, they had to remove it from the attic. It had been there since the 1920s when the original woman had purchased it at the time. This was a family member from a couple of generations later that was dispersing an estate, including this building with all of its contents. So I think she said she paid 500 crowns to purchase it and 1,500 crowns to transport it to her place, which was sort of like my industrial steam press. I paid $100 for the press and 6,000 for the boiler to run it. Yeah. Okay, it's 20 to 2. Just a few more things. Also in the book is an essay on the series that I've been working on with the shift to twill blocks. And I've included photographs of the drafts up to the time it was written. Since then, I've gone on to weave a couple of different designs. So I'm just going to quickly run through them. This was the proof of concept. I needed to, just because something is possible in theory doesn't mean that it's actually going to weave up the way you want it to. So I needed a proof of concept. So I came up with this. There's something very simple, working with a single repeat of the line a couple of times, and then extending the blocks to make the thicker, shallower line here. So this peak here is a single repeat of the blocks, and then over here is just a single repeat several times to make the border. And because I always do the least work possible, because I'm inherently lazy, I guess, or as some people would say, efficient, the other side was woven up because there are fewer shafts being lifted and more weft is visible on this side of the cloth. More warp is visible on this side of the cloth. In most cases, I prefer the warp side, and I have my reasons, but that's just me. I've had other people say that they prefer the other side. Well, fine, do whatever side you want. So once I had the proof of concept, I thought, okay, now I have to start playing around with these twill lines. What can I do? Well, I could do, could I do curves? Turns out, yes, I can. So the draft for this one is threaded this way and then this way in its direction. So I took the peak and then flipped it over so that the beads line up like that. Well, that was all well and good, but still a little bit boring perhaps. So what else can I do with these curving lines? So this was the next one. And this one is more white on one side, more teal on the other. And again, I did this direction, this direction, this direction, just to keep things nice and symmetrical. And that was all well and good, but it still didn't appeal to me all that much. This one is going to be harder to see. I'll put this side up because it should be easier. Okay. So now we're starting to break away from the simple progressions and start to play around with making the lines move. So then I got really bold and I thought, okay, now I want to do something asymmetrical. So I played around, and this was originally a reject until my inner voice said, stop do not delete that. Take another look. Always a good idea to listen to your inner voice. So I thought, okay, this wasn't what I intended, but is it worthy? And this is what I came up with. So it's asymmetrically symmetrical, if you can use that word. But we're starting to get into something a little bit more visually interesting here. After I did that, I thought, okay, that's fine. Now I want to play around with the threading and make it less less regular, shall we say. And so this was the next one. And I called this one daisy chain because it kind of reminded me of a daisy chain. This one is equal numbers of shafts up and down. So it was not a 1, 3, 3, 1, with an unequal number of shafts up or down. It was an equal number of shafts up or down. So it's more balanced or more equal in what you see. Now it's obviously the negative of the other, but it's still pretty balanced in you're seeing as much weft as you are warp on that one. I'm talking too much. From there, I did this one. Again, working with asymmetry, but in a symmetrical fashion. And again, back to the unequal number of shafts up and down. And then I wanted to play around with some horizontal lines. I've been only doing vertical designs to this point. So I thought, well, let's see if I can do something with horizontal. And again, the opposite colors on the other side. Then I went back to the horizontal again. And there's this one. Now, I'm not sure that this one is included in the book. This is one of my recent ones just off the loom. And this one is literally just off the loom, was only wet finished the day before yesterday and yesterday. And this one has an oopsie in it. I thought I'd grab one that didn't have that oopsie. And yet here it is showing up very clearly on the screen. This is an issue here. What happened was I had a weft loop that I needed to back up and fix. And I couldn't re-engage after I had backed up. And I realized that I was weaving from the thumb drive instead of from the laptop. So I had to go back and save the file to the laptop, which I had not done. I was in so much of a hurry to get down to Vancouver that I had neglected to save the file to my laptop. And so that's why I was weaving off the thumb drive. So I saved the file to the laptop. And then because I was so discombobulated by that point, I called up the incorrect treadling and started weaving with the incorrect treadling, which is why you've got that weird kind of little thing happening there, which I didn't discover until I was reaching the end of the treadling and realized that the hem was not showing up the same way as it had on the other end. So it's like, oh, geez, here you are, not perfect again. So I've included an essay where I talk about the development of the series. I've included a skeleton tie-up. It's 16 shafts. You can extend it to more if you're interested. The weave structure gives you half tones like you get on Overshot or some of the other tide weaves. And the half tones are actually part of what makes this whole weave structure interesting to me, because the weave structure is actually more like what Davison calls a wall of Troy. So you get these weird little zigzag changes happening as you weave through it, but it gives a very interesting textures and an interesting texture that is actually going to benefit a tea towel. And one last thing that I wanted to, that I brought down to show you is this jacket. I wove in 1985, 1986, had it turned into a jacket, a reversible jacket. And it is a stitched double weave to make the motif. And in this cloth, I was kind of hearkening back to the bumblebees, but I didn't have enough shafts to do it like the bumblebees, because that was done on a jacquard loom. I only had 16 shafts, so I had to do a stitch double weave. And the story behind this one, the rest of the story behind this one, is that I submitted it to the Informal Fashion Show for Convergence in Toronto in 1986. This is how I know when I did it. The weaving conference, Convergence, was one of the first conferences held at the brand new Toronto Convention Center, and the AC was cranked up to freezer, which was not unwelcome because it was like 90 degrees out with 100% humidity outside. But when you came in from the outside, it was freezing cold. So when I got my hands on the jacket again, I wore it. See, it was that cold that this heavy jacket got worn. The last day of the conference, I particularly wanted to go to Convergence because they were having someone come over from England by the name of Morpeth Roberts to teach a class on wet finishing. I thought I've got to take this class. I need to know more about wet finishing. And I had an absolutely fascinating time. Fascinating woman, really tiny, like really tiny, maybe 5'2" at that. Just tremendous amount of knowledge. And the last day of the conference, I went back into the vendor hall to say, to talk to a couple of the vendors that I'd only ever met through mail. Wanted to, say thank you for the service they provided and all the rest. The vendor hall was slammed. I mean, we were literally, cheek by jowl. So even though they were really busy, I knew they would get to me eventually if I just stood there quietly. But I had my jacket around my shoulders like this. And at one point, I could feel tugging at my jacket. And I thought, oh, geez, my jacket was caught on somebody's bag or something. So I reached over and tried to, take it back kind of thing, get it away from whatever it was hung up on. And it wouldn't come. So I thought, well, that's odd. What's it caught on? So I looked down and all I could see is this head with the fabric up to very, very, very close to her face. And I said, oh, if you want to take a look at the jacket, go ahead. And her friend, who was about the same height, was kind of standing there like, and she said to the person examining my jacket. Well, are you happy now? And I thought, oh, okay, I'm not sure where we're going here. And I looked at her, she looked at me and she said, she's been all over this conference and she's been so disappointed in so many of the textiles, and she's finally found something she likes. She can go home happy now, right, Morpheth? And Morpheth looked up at me and she went, oh, it's you. I thought, okay, I know it's me, but not quite sure what you mean. And I said, hi, Morpheth. You know? And she said, yes, I'm happy now. And I thought, I think that's a compliment, but I'm not entirely sure. So I looked at her friend and I looked at Morpheth, and Morpheth was standing there with his very pleased smile on her face. And her friend said, yeah, she said, she's been so grumpy. She's seen so much cloth that she didn't like. And she obviously really likes yours. And Morpheth looked at me and she said, yeah, she said, I should have known it would be you. I thought, yeah, I think there's a compliment in there. I'm going to take it as such. So I said, well, if you like the cloth so much, I've got some remnants left. If you want a piece of the cloth, I would mail it to you. And she looked, oh, would you? And I said, yeah, it's just remnants. I said, I got a piece maybe about that big if you want. And she went, oh, yes, yes. Do you have my address? I said, well, I think it's on your teaching handouts, isn't it? And she went, yeah. Yeah, she said, mail it there and I'll get it. And so I did. And she wrote me a lovely letter when she got it, thanking me so much for the sample and sharing it with me. So, you know, it's just, there are so many ways to weave or not weave. Yeah, there's so many different pieces of equipment. I mean, in 1986, I was still chafing under the negativity that I had been getting from hand weavers, because I was using a Dobby with a fly shuttle and, oh my God, an automatic cloth advance. I couldn't call myself a hand weaver anymore. And I kept saying to them, but I'm still doing everything myself. What do you mean I can't call myself a hand weaver? No, with all that equipment, the loom is doing it all for you. And I'm going, no, yeah, it's doing everything for me, including making my mistakes. So to have someone of her knowledge and experience tell me I'd done good was a real picker-upper, and it meant the world to me. You know, as hand weavers, when I started weaving, I hope it's not so much now, but when I started hand weaving, there was this divide between handwoven and not handwoven cloth, you know, commercial, industrial. And there were so many people that would say things like, oh, well, commercially woven fabric is terrible, it's just terrible quality. Well, I'm sorry, but I was a seamstress and I sewed an awful lot of commercially, industrially made fabric that was very good quality, because my mother taught me, when you're poor, you can't afford poor quality clothing. You have to buy good quality fabric and then do really good work to sew it so that it lasts for a long time. And I was certainly well aware of the ranges of quality of cloth that were available commercially, because any fabric store in the land will have that range. They may not carry the real high upper end stuff because not very many people can afford it. But if you live in some, you know, place like New York or Toronto that has a garment district, or, you know, Toronto with the Academy there, with FIT in New York, there are lots of people working with extremely good quality textiles, and it certainly does not make it poor quality just because it's been woven on an industrial loom. yeah, I've seen some pretty poor quality industrial cloth, but I've also seen an awful lot of very, very high quality stuff. And working in the drapery place, there was a similar range of lesser quality to extremely good quality, and I could tell the difference. I mean, you just knew that, and it was all industrially woven. So after, oh gosh, I'm 73. After 47 years of weaving, I can tell you several things. One, I do not know it all. I still have more to learn. It's not your tools, it's what you do with them. Whether you weave on a backstrap loom or a TC1 jacquard or anything in between, your tool is not what's important. It's what you do with it. It is, in this day and age, if you want to sell handwoven textiles, you have to sell your designs. That's what's going to sell your cloth. It's going to be your design aesthetic. It's going to be your creativity. And it's almost beside the point that your fingers have touched every single inch of that yarn, every inch of the way. So we have to respect quality when we see it, however it is made. We have to respect the knowledge of people who work with tools different from ours, as long as they are making good quality. I don't know, that's basically where I'm at. Okay, my samples, when I design these, are you working from a profile draft or working with chunks of a full threading? Okay, for most of my block designs, I work with a profile draft, but a profile draft doesn't work for these shifted twill blocks because there's no, the Fiberworks does not have a library to exchange the profile into a threading draft. I would have to do it by hand. So I just do it by hand in the first place. So what I did was I had to drag out the graph paper. I knew how it should work, and I knew where I wanted to wind up. I had to figure out how I got there. And doing it thread by thread, because it's all twill progressions, they're just shifted. So I just play with that 4-thread twill progression. And then when it comes time to move on to the next section, I shift down. Now, so far, I pretty much always work in a progression, and I don't break them. That may be what the direction I go next is, to start working with breaking the twill line and having it go offset, like in a herringbone or whatever. But I haven't quite got there yet because I'm still exploring what I'm working with at this point. So there's no one answer. You know, you have to work with the processes the way they work for you. I visualize very, very well. Not everybody does. I do recommend to people that if they don't know how to do a weaving draft, how to do a thread by thread weaving draft, that they become comfortable with that. Whether they do it with weaving software or not, it's totally up to them. Personally, I started weaving in 1975. There were no personal computers. So I did everything by hand on graph paper. But once the weaving software came along and I could see what the weaving software did for me was not save me time designing. What it allowed me to do was generate 30 drafts instead of 3. So instead of settling for something that was, well, okay, I guess this will work, I keep going until I get what I want. And so I still might spend 30 hours coming up with a design, but I've come up with, there have been multiple iterations in that design process, not just 1 or 2 or 3. Overall, I think I've become a better designer. And now I can do that quickly enough that I'm no longer spending 30 hours, although I was pretty close to 30 hours on that initial proof of concept, let me tell you. But I do spend 3 to 4 to 5 hours at times coming up with a design, because I'll start one, I'll start going in a direction, I'll change it, I'll flip it around, I'll rotate it, mirror image it, whatever. Until I find something that is reasonable. That usually takes an hour to 90 minutes. I'll leave it, I'll come back to it, I'll look at it again with fresh eyes, might make a few adjustments. For example, this waves one, and I think I included this in the book. You see this smooth transition from this curve down into the border? The original threading did not have that. It had a very awkward transition between the central design area and the border. So when I went back with the fresh eyes and I looked at it again, and I thought, yeah, I got tired and I couldn't quite figure out where to go from there and make that happen more easily. But aha, now I see what I need to do. So I smoothed that out on either side. And so now I have a nice smooth transition, not an awkward one. So I'm much happier about that. Then I fuss around with the borders, because I have a set number of threads for my tea towels. In this case, it's 856. So my drafts, I want to fit precisely into that 856 so that I have no leftover yarns or I don't run short. Okay. On the other hand, sometimes Laura makes mistakes. See this? I made a threading mistake. So when I got to the end of the draft, I had threads left over. So I had to decide, do I take out 5/6 of the warp and rethread it all, which was another 3+ hour job, more because I didn't have all my neatly arranged bundles of groupings, or do I just go with it? So I went with it, and the only thing wrong with it is that it's not symmetrical. Okay, all right. I'm not going to show you that, so I just got the mistake in it. So it's not symmetrical. You see this one here? It should look like this here. So I left out that entire section of the draft. It's the only thing wrong with it. It's not what I wanted. It's not what I intended. But there's not a flaw insofar as anything that is going to adversely affect the towels from drying dishes. So I've gone ahead and I've continued to weave it off. You know, my hanging thread of shame is telling the story. But you know what? New weavers say to me, "Oh, I can hardly wait until I don't make mistakes anymore." Honey, I got news for you. Okay, I've gone past the 2 hours. Are there any other questions or comments or observations? What is the name of the book? Stories from the Matrix, Essays on Weaving and Life. It is available at blurb.com. You can look, you can get the link from my blog, which is laurasloom.blogspot.com. If you're on Facebook, I'm Laura Fry, and you can shoot me a friend request if you're not currently friends with me and you want to see my daily musings, ramblings, my political stance. I've gotten a lot more political the older I've gotten. No, it's not on my website. It's on my blog, laurasloom.blogspot.com. No worries. Yeah, most of my activity these days is on my blog. some on Facebook, and I do belong to Mastodon now. I no longer belong to Twitter. Okay, then if that's all, thank you so much for coming to my party. I've enjoyed this birthday very much, and hope to see you online somewhere. And happy weaving, everybody.